Ladies and gentlemen, the Geneva Press Club and the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons are very pleased to invite you to the launch of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor 2026 edition, the annual report published by the Norwegian People's Aid in collaboration with the Federation of American Scientists. This report is even more relevant this year. For the moderation of the discussion, I will give the floor to Alistair Burnett, Head of Communication from ICA. Yes, thank you very much, Alistair Burnett. I give you now the floor, and thank you for choosing Geneva Press Club for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geraldine, and thank you for hosting us today. So welcome to the Geneva Press Club. Those of you who've made it through the beginnings of the snow, the winter is back, apparently. And those of you who are joining us online, welcome. So the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor is a very significant annual publication that basically assesses compliance with the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And in that, basically what it looks at is the state of both nuclear weapons in the world, numbers, types, trends, but also obviously the state of nuclear politics. And this year we'll be hearing a lot about that. I'm Alistair Burnett, as Geraldine said. I'm the head of communications for the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, of which Norwegian People's Aid is a key partner. And ICAN is based here in Geneva, as you may know. The Ban Monitor is a research project led by Norwegian People's Aid, but it has contributions from a broad range of external experts and institutions, particularly the Federation of American Scientists. It tracks progress towards a world without nuclear weapons and highlights activities that stand in the way of the elimination of nuclear weapons. And obviously, as we've just heard, this is a very apposite moment, given wars currently underway involving 3 nuclear-armed countries in acts of aggression: Russia, the United States, and Israel. And the fact that there are no more arms control treaties in force. The last one, this New START agreement, expired at the beginning of February. So effectively, there are no limits, no legal limits, diplomatic limits on numbers and types of nuclear weapons anymore. In measuring the progress, the Weapons Ban Monitor uses the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, what we call TPNW in English, as a primary yardstick, because the treaty codifies the norms and actions that are needed to create and maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. We sent out a press release under embargo yesterday, and I hope you received that. And if you didn't, let me know at the end and I can add you to our press list. There's also a handout which summarizes the key findings of this year's Ban Monitor report, which you can pick up here. And if you're joining us online, you can email Erland, who you have been in communication with already, and he can send you a digital copy of that. So that's it from me. I'm just going to introduce the people you've really come to hear, not me, obviously. So joining us today, immediately to my right, is Grete Østrand. She's the special advisor on weapons issues at Norwegian People's Aid and oversees the monitor. Next to her is Hans Christensen. He's the director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. They are the world's effectively authority on the numbers and types of nuclear weapons. Of course, not all states are fully transparent about that. So there's a lot of research and a lot of digging that needs to be done in order to do the work that they do. And On my far right is Stuart Casey Maslan, who's visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg and is the editor of this year's edition of the report. So I'm going to ask each of them in turn to make some remarks before opening the press conference to questions. So Greta, would you like to start?
Thank you, Alistair. And thank you for coming today, despite the snow. In 2026, we have a world that is divided over nuclear weapons, moving in opposing directions, both towards and away from the objective of eliminating nuclear weapons. On the one side, we have a clear minority of states that reject nuclear weapons as a clear majority of states that reject nuclear weapons as a nuclear security liability. And on the other side, we have a minority of 42 states that are placing increasing value on nuclear weapons as a national security asset and placing the entire world in great danger in doing so. The risk of the use of nuclear weapons is real and immediate. The danger that conflicts involving nuclear armed states could escalate to nuclear use is a growing concern. So the choices that states and political leaders make in 2026 matter. They have to decide whether to treat nuclear weapons as a collective threat or a national security asset. And those choices should be guided by a clear understanding of the risks that nuclear deterrence entails, the potential for loss of control, and the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that any use of nuclear weapons would have. So in this presentation, we will be talking about these two opposing trends and views. I will say a few words about the majority view, and then Hans and Stuart will address the actions of the minority. In the Ban Monitor, we evaluate the nuclear weapons related policies and practices of 197 states. They are the ones that can become parties to the multilateral treaties in the legal architecture on weapons of mass destruction. Of those 197 states, 155 states, almost 4/5, currently maintain defense postures that are based exclusively on non-nuclear means. But 42 states have nuclear weapons-based defense postures. They are the 9 nuclear-armed states: China, France, India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And then there are the 33 nuclear umbrella states, which means that they are non-nuclear armed states that have arrangements of extended nuclear deterrence with one or more nuclear armed allies. One umbrella state, Belarus, is an ally of Russia. And then there are 29 umbrella states that have a multilateral arrangement of extended nuclear deterrence through NATO, and 3 umbrella states, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, that have bilateral arrangements of nuclear deterrence with the United States. And of those 33 umbrella states, as many as 29 are European, which is a fact that I would like for you to remember throughout the presentation. The only 4 umbrella states outside Europe are Australia, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. This diagram looks at the status of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, among the 197 states. No nuclear-armed state has yet adhered to the TPNW, but every non-nuclear-armed state that joins strengthens political pressure for nuclear disarmament. And since the TPNW was negotiated in the UN in 2017, it has seen a steady growth in support. And this signals growing global rejection of nuclear weapons as a collective security liability, and it also signals renewed determination to advance nuclear disarmament. At the end of 2025, there were 99 states, so just over half of the world's 197 states, that had joined the TPNW as either parties or as signatories that hadn't yet ratified the treaty. So as you can see in the diagram, basically 74 states parties and 25 signatories. And we do know that in several of the signatory states, ratification processes are underway. So further progress in expansion of the membership of the treaty appears likely in 2026. And then beyond its parties and signatories, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor currently classifies a total of 41 states as other supporters of the TPNW, and that's based on their voting in the UN General Assembly. When we include those other supporters, the total support for the TPNW reached 140 states by the end of 2025, or 71% of the global total, and that's up by 2 from a year earlier. And also several states in this other supporters category have initiated domestic processes to sign or accede to the treaty. And then there is a small group of undecided countries spread across the world in all regions. And the opposed countries, number 44, that's the same number as last year. If we break down the support for the TPNW by region, we see that it's strong across all regions of the world except Europe. In Africa, all states supported the TPNW in 2025 as states parties, signatories, or other supporters. The Americas is the region with the highest share of states parties, with over 74% of states already full states parties to the treaty. But then 3/4 of the opposition to the treaty is concentrated in Europe, where 33 of the region's 47 states voted against the treaty in the UN General Assembly in 2025. Europe has only 5 states parties: Austria, the Holy See, Ireland, Malta, and San Marino, and 1 signatory, which is Liechtenstein. So as a result, Europe stands out as a major obstacle to further progress toward universalization of the TPNW. In 2026, the TPNW is in its 9th year after opening for signature. This graph shows the speed of adherence to the TPNW relative to the other key multilateral treaties in the legal architecture for weapons of mass destruction in the first 10 years after they opened for signature. The Biological Weapons Convention, the BWC here, the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT. And as you can see, the TPNW started out very strong, despite obstruction by several nuclear armed states, but then fell behind the other treaties at approximately 3.5 years after opening for signature, before picking up more speed again after the COVID-19 pandemic. And today, while still behind all of the other weapons of mass destruction treaties in numbers, the TPNW has since after COVID largely followed the same trajectory of ratifications and accessions that the Biological Weapons Convention and the NPT did at the equivalent point in time. So it's important to remember that it took several years also for those treaties to accrue the authority and the value that they have today. And the objective must be universal adherence to all of the components in this legal architecture on weapons of mass destruction, meaning that all states should be party to each and every one of them. For the part of the report that is about estimation and analysis of global nuclear forces, the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor collaborates with the Nuclear Information Project of the Federation of American Scientists. So I will now give the floor to Hans Christensen on the actions of the 42 states with nuclear weapons-based defense posture before Stuart covers the legal perspective on that.
Thank you, Grete. And thank you for coming here today. I have first have to say that we very much appreciate this opportunity now for several years in a row to work with you guys in analyzing the status of nuclear forces around the world and the trends, in terms of what is going on. And as you all probably know, it's not going well. Things are moving in the wrong direction. And so what I would do here with the slides I have available is just give you, first of all, a very brief status, like the snapshot, the headlines, so to speak. Talk a little about the trends we see, what is changing, what is the direction of where we're heading. Then a few examples of what the nuclear armed states have, the status of their forces, etc. And then some examples of how they operated, how do they deploy their nuclear weapons? They're not just sort of in a basement somewhere, they're actually out there. And then some examples at the very end using some satellite photos about, the situation here in Europe, just a couple of examples of where things are heading. So now I have to press this button. Is that the one? Okay. Is there any chance we can get it on that monitor up here in front as well? Oh, no. Okay. All right. So of the 42 states that have nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons-based arrangements, I think that the three main themes that we see happening are that countries and allies around the broad spectrum of countries that are involved in the nuclear business are increasingly placing more value on nuclear weapons. Remember, it used to be that after the end of the Cold War, the emphasis of even nuclear weapon states was to reduce the numbers, was to reduce the salience and role that nuclear weapons played in their military strategies. Over the last decade, somewhat, that has changed completely. Now we're in a situation in which these countries are actively, and I would say even aggressively, pushing and promoting the role and value that nuclear weapons have. And ideas about elimination and disarmament and reducing the role of nuclear weapons are increasingly being ridiculed as naive, that you're not understanding the world we live in, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a major shift on the international stage from what it was just a decade ago. And with this come a shift from a world in which countries thought stability and sort of normalization, if you will, of nuclear relations to one in which major nuclear armed states are now officially in an antagonistic relationship. They're officially using nuclear weapons in an overt way to threaten each other and remind each other about it. That has always been in the background after the end of the Cold War, but now it's moved up to the front. And with this comes a new dynamic. That dynamic is about increased emphasis on the solution of nuclear, that countries look to nuclear weapons to sort of help fix a security problem. So that takes the form in nuclear weapon states that are modernizing, not just refurbishing their nuclear arsenals, but adding new nuclear weapon types and updating their strategies, et cetera, changing the way they operate and exercise with these and the way they talk about it. That dynamic is driving an action-reaction situation that very much is similar to what we saw during the Cold War. Countries will, posture with nuclear forces to appear strong. They will increase their capabilities every time they modernize. Other countries will react in a similar way. So this tit-for-tat relationship is now in full swing again. There's a lot of discussion about whether we are in an arms race or not, nuclear arms race. That was very much the case in the sort of 50s, 60s, and early 70s, where it literally was a case about building the most nuclear weapons and getting them out there. That is not quite what we're experiencing today. One shouldn't really compare the two because it's a different situation. It's a different world. There's certainly increases going on, but it's still not just a a blunt exercise in trying to build and deploy the most. It's more a competition it's a technological competition, it's a military competition, rather than necessarily a question of numbers. But we can get back to that in the question and answer session. Is that the one? Yep. So here are the current trends that we see. And the first one that's up front is that the era of nuclear reductions is over. This is something we have been pointing out now for, I think, about 5 years or so. But every year we have to remind people that what an enormous shift this is in the international situation. All numerical limits in terms of arms treaties have fallen away. There's nothing left. There's some generic treaties that are dealing with management and non-proliferation, signals, test announcements, whatever. But the point is, numerical limits are gone. So we are, for the first time since the early 1970s, I think, in a situation where we're at an open-ended situation. There are no legal limits. And therefore, all the nuclear weapon states we're seeing today, except Israel, are already increasing their arsenals or have announced recently plans to do so. All of them, except one. Again, a fundamentally different role than what we saw just 10, 15 years ago. And it's not just a question of building up their arsenals. It's also a question of adding new types of nuclear weapons that are supposed to serve new or enhanced roles. This comes along with this dynamic that you look for nuclear weapons to solve problems, military and security problems. And they're being added to the arsenal every year. We see that both in Russia, China for sure, all the nuclear weapon states except Israel. We're now also beginning to see it in Europe in a way we have not seen since the end of the Cold War, literally. With this comes also an increased nuclear signaling. Countries speak with nuclear weapons. They do these things, they exercise, they add nuclear weapons because it's a message to adversaries. And it's also a message to allies. So again, the value, the salience of nuclear weapon goes up. We see this in many ways, both in terms of the types of exercises that they have, in terms of the types of routine operations they're doing with the nuclear forces. They're growing, they're increasing, they're moving further forward. They're getting more aggressive, sort of in-your-face type of operations. This is all adding to this need to show determination and strength. But it's also adding to new risks of potential escalation. Then we see an increased emphasis on non-strategic nuclear weapons. These are weapons that don't have intercontinental range, but are shorter range systems that are used to either fight local wars or regional scenarios, limited numbers relative to the Big Bang, so to speak. And here, with that come new plans, new thinkings about how to use nuclear weapons in the transition from conventional war into nuclear war. That means we see more options, more plans, more examples of exercises to emphasize the role of nuclear weapons. In Europe, we see that with NATO's annual exercise, Steadfast Noon, that's happening normally in October or something. And in Russia, we have seen it a couple of years ago with their exercises where they, over a period of 3 months, had a number of different exercises with tactical nuclear weapons to demonstrate their capabilities. And we also see increased involvement of non-nuclear states in these nuclear operations. This is sort of a gray zone because there's supposed to be nuclear weapon states and then the non-nuclear weapon states. But because some non-nuclear weapon states are allies to nuclear weapon states, we're now seeing an increased interest and emphasis on incorporating these non-nuclear countries more directly into nuclear operations. So in exercises, for example, we just saw last year, in the fall last year in NATO Steadfast Noon exercise, we saw for the first time involvement of all the Nordic countries. Their air forces were contributed to this exercise. They don't get the nuclear weapons on board, but they use their conventional forces to support the nuclear strike operations. And so this is an entanglement of nuclear and non-nuclear that is growing. And because of the uncertainty we see not only in terms of what Russia is doing, what China is doing, but also what the US government is doing, the increased uncertainty about whether countries can count on the US nuclear umbrella for their protection, we are seeing increasing emphasis on non-nuclear countries getting involved in new nuclear sharing arrangements, nuclear extended deterrent arrangements with each other or other nuclear armed states. And we even see prominent discussions in some non-nuclear countries about whether it's necessary to get their own nuclear weapons again. So these are major changes and important trends for the world in the last 10, 15 years. In terms of what we have out there, there's sort of a couple of big trends that's going on. We're still at a level of about 12,100 and something nuclear warheads, the things that go bang in the world. This is a huge reduction compared to the Cold War, but things are beginning to level out and change. We still see a reduction in the total number, but that is not because countries are reducing nuclear arsenals. That's because they're continuing to dismantle warheads that have been retired several years ago, are in the queue for dismantlement. They're not part of the military arsenal. They continue to be eaten away, so to speak, with the dismantlement process. So therefore, we see the total inventory of the military stockpile plus the retired going down. But those that are available for use, those that are in the military stockpiles assigned to missiles and aircraft and what have you, that number is increasing again. And here our estimate is getting close to 10,000 nuclear weapons again. And we have calculated, of course, to give people a sense of what that is, that it's sort of equivalent to 135 plus thousand Hiroshima bombs compared to the Hiroshima bomb that was dropped on Japan in 1945. Now, most of these weapons that are in the military stockpile are not deployed. They're not on the forces. They're in reserve, so they can be brought out and put on the aircraft, the missiles, if necessary. But nearly half of all the weapons that are in military stockpiles are deployed. They're deployed on ballistic missile submarines, land-based long-range missiles, and in some cases with non-strategic nuclear forces. And this is an area where there are a lot of changes going on. We can illustrate this in many different ways, and there's nothing like big dots or small dots on a big map. And here, of course, the dark red is the inventory of weapons that are in the stockpiles, the military useful weapons, so to speak. The light red at the bottom there of Russia and the United States, those are weapons, and you can also see France, those are weapons that have been retired or awaiting dismantlement, right? So this is the status. And what really stands out from an illustration like this is that there are only two countries in the world who think you have to have more than some hundreds of nuclear weapons to be safe. The United States and Russia are in a completely different category than all nuclear weapon states in the world. And that has a lot to do with their history. They were the large nuclear weapon states that were the primary driver of the Cold War. And they're very much still stuck in those military postures at lower levels, yes, but they're still fundamentally in the same kind of structure with their nuclear forces as they had in those days. And like I said, huge progress since the end of the Cold War. But so the green line, that's the total inventory talked about, the military stockpiles as well as the retired weapons. That is continuing to trickle down, but as you can see, it's leveling out. The red line, that is the inventory of weapons, nuclear warheads for the military forces. That you can see for the last, 5-10 years has now started to trickle up again. So that's the trend. And so, if you look 20 years into the future, we are likely to see significantly larger nuclear weapons arsenals of all the major nuclear weapon states, with many more different types of nuclear weapons. That's the trend we're in. Now, in terms of where they put them, if you look at the deployed warheads, this is only the category that are on launchers. or on bases for launchers that are active launchers. So ballistic missile submarines, land-based missiles, bombers, what have you. Obviously, the vast majority are Russian and the United States. France also has a significant number. But what I want to point you to here are the two sort of top countries there, with China and India. Those are two smaller nuclear weapon states, relatively speaking, that are now also beginning to deploy nuclear weapons in an operational way. In the past, they have been locked up in depots and not deployed on the systems. Now we are seeing them beginning to deploy relatively small numbers, but nonetheless, they're moving in that direction. We're going to see more of that in the next decade, no doubt about it. And if you see on where are these nuclear weapons mostly deployed, they're overwhelmingly on ballistic missile submarines, on land-based ICBMs. Those systems are on high alert. In the case of the United States and Russia, almost all of them, Britain and France also. China is increasing its alert level as well. These are forces that are ready to use within minutes. The land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles are on alert and can fly within 4 minutes from the order when the president gives the order. And this has been this weird situation for the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War, that countries have held on to that way of deploying nuclear weapons instead of giving it up. And I think that has been a huge mistake, because it has sort of locked the military postures into a certain mindset and situation that otherwise would have reduced the salience and role of nuclear weapons, and also vastly increased the risk, of course, that something could go wrong or being misunderstood in a situation. So this is some of the things that were not cleaned up, and that's now come back to bite us. In Europe, this is going to be the last part of what I say here. We have deployment still, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, in several nuclear countries, in several non-nuclear countries, and one nuclear country. The arrangement between the United States and Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Turkey to provide nuclear weapons to their air forces, their national air forces, that they can deliver in wartime, is an arrangement that goes all the way back to the 1950s, early 60s. Britain had American nuclear weapons on its territory for a long time. Back in 2005, 6, 7, in that period, they were pulled back. The United States did it without announcing anything. It was something we found out. Without announcing anything or trying to get anything diplomatically from doing that. It just did it. Now we're seeing the return of American nuclear weapons to England, both in terms of what Americans are going to deploy there, but also that the Brits have now recently announced that they're going to get some American weapons for their aircraft as well. And in Belarus, we see the Russians building a nuclear weapons depot in Belarus, and supplying short-range ballistic missiles to Belarus armed forces, and supplying them with nuclear warheads. Not handing it over to the Belarus army, but supplying them like an American arrangement with nuclear sharing in Europe. And most recently, we have seen reports of the Russians building a forward deployment base for a new type of intermediate range nuclear missile, dual capable, but with nuclear capability. So just talking about that base in Britain, which we've now seen examples on. So this is a picture just from last week of Lakenheath Air Base in Europe, in England, southern England, so southeast England. What you see here, of course, the layout of the base with its runway and support facilities and bunkers and what have you. Now, in the red square box there, you have the area that has particular interest right now. That is an area where it appears that they're building, upgrading the facilities to reintroduce nuclear weapons. We've seen lots of contract information coming out about the return of the nuclear mission to Lakenheath, et cetera. And there are even strong indications that weapons were airlifted into Lakenheath last summer. We haven't seen any official confirmation, but we never get confirmations about these, but there's still some intelligence work that has to be done to get that. But what you see here are 10 hardened aircraft shelters in this special security perimeter. These are specific security perimeters that are built for nuclear weapon storage sites. And this is a base that's expanding enormously, in addition to F-15E strike aircraft that have nuclear capability. We are seeing 2 squadrons of F-35A jets also being based at that base. So this is a significant change in the northern part of NATO's nuclear posture. Then, looking east, this is what I talked about in Belarus. There is near Asipovichi, that's where you have the base for Iskander short-range ballistic missiles. And to the right, you can see the nuclear weapons storage facility that the Russians have been building. And it has all the fingerprints of Russian nuclear weapons storage sites, the features that they demand or they require to be able to deploy nuclear weapons. That site is now getting close to completion. And I just noticed here on this picture, for example, that the very last thing you can see is that construction crews that were around this site have now been pulled back, indicating that the site is nearing completion. The top right is a picture from a former airbase where the Russians are building sort of a forward deployment base for this new intermediate range missile, Oreshnik. And the outline here again, double fenced security perimeters, guard posts, what have you, and then construction, as you can see in the middle there, of suspected launcher garages. So that's what's happening on the eastern side, so to speak. And the countries themselves, Russia as well, has many, 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 many more nuclear capability. So that's what I'm going to end with and hand it over. Thanks very much. You get the power.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to pick up a little bit where Hans started. He talked about the fact that there are no upper limits on the arsenals of, at the very least, the 5 nuclear weapon states. That's what we call vertical proliferation. And that is absolutely correct, what he said. We do, of course, have constraints on what we call horizontal proliferation. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, better known as the NPT, has 190 of 195 states, 2 of them already covered by New Zealand. So we have a very, very high level of adherence to the NPT. It's described as the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. But for some years now, that cornerstone has been eroding, and that erosion is becoming more serious. Back in 1959, the then Senator Kennedy, before he was elected, was already talking about what he described, what analysts were describing as the nth country problem. What he meant by that is, if we don't do something, then a lot of states are going to seek to acquire nuclear weapons. There were programs all around the world, including, for example, in peace-loving Sweden. There was an active nuclear weapons development program, which of course they later stopped. His concern in those days was that nth country problem would be that 25 states would get nuclear, would develop, acquire nuclear weapons, which doesn't sound so very many, except when you realize that we only had half of the states in the world today. We were talking then about a quarter of the world's nations having nuclear weapons. Fast forward to today, and we are starting to see very worrying discussions in states that are party to the NPT and therefore have pledged never to acquire nuclear weapons, considering that possibility. We're not quite there yet, but the fact that these discussions are even being held and being held in public and being held by senior respected figures in Germany, in Poland, in Japan, in South Korea, shows that we have a very serious problem. And what I would say the downside of the NPT is it is oh so easy to leave it. You only need to give 3 months' notice. You need to say that there are extraordinary events linked to the subject matter of the treaty that have jeopardized your supreme interests, but you make that decision. There's no international oversight per se. Of course, the Security Council might have a word to say, but they're going to be impotent to prevent a withdrawal. And after those 3 months, in contradistinction to a number of the more recent disarmament treaties, if at the end of those 3 months you are engaged in an armed conflict, that won't matter. You leave. The treaties like the Anti-Personnel Mine Convention, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, say if you leave, you give notice of withdrawal, and then you are engaged in an armed conflict, you continue to be bound. Not so the NPT. We did see over the course of the previous decades, the NPT restraining development. Not entirely. As you know, we have 4 other so-called non-nuclear weapon states, Israel, North Korea, India, and Pakistan. In the past, we had apartheid South Africa. When the Soviet Union broke up, we had Belarus, we had Kazakhstan and Ukraine. But those additional 4 states I just mentioned, they gave up their nuclear weapons. They joined the NPT. By design, the NPT is a discriminatory legal regime. That's the reason why India, in particular, is so opposed to it. It divides the world, using Greta's word, it divides the world into those that are allowed to have nuclear weapons and those that are not. The TPNW is different. It does not allow for such discrimination. Everyone who joins must fully comply with all of its provisions. There's no, we have the right to continue to hold nuclear weapons. If you join the treaty and you have them, you must give them up. If you join the treaty and you have foreign weapons on your territory, they must leave. The fact, though, that there are states that are parties to that treaty and there are states that are not parties to that treaty explains a little bit our language. Compliant refers to those states that have joined, the states parties, because under international law, the law of treaties, you're only bound by what you sign up to in treaty law. However, our analysis goes beyond those states parties, which of course are our first and foremost our focus, to look at all other states. Are they compatible? Is what they are doing compatible with the obligations, with the prohibitions in the treaty? And you'll see also a little category at the end that we added in previous years of concern. Those are states that we can't say for certain are not compatible with the TPNW, but as the name suggests, we are concerned that they are either considering or moving towards it. 152 states are fully either compliant or compatible with the TPNW. They do nothing that would infringe its prohibitions. That is 3/4 of the world community. But that significant minority, the other 45, is what is holding us back from what is an accepted goal by every single state, nuclear disarmament. The timetable, the modalities, the process, of course, deeply divergent. So here you can see what is needed for those states to comply with the TPNW prohibitions. The 9 nuclear weapon states, we don't need to say anymore, Hans has covered that very well. There is also the relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, which is not only not compatible with the TPNW, but we argue is also a violation of the NPT because the Trident missiles that are on the UK submarines are leased from the United States. Yes, the warhead is ostensibly a British one, but it is so very clearly closely based on the American warhead as to be indistinguishable. You can't take an apple and put a label on it saying orange. It doesn't turn it into an orange. It's still an apple. The most number of non-compatible, as you can see, is the prohibition on assisting or encouraging prohibited activities. That's a standard provision in disarmament treaties, starting in particular with the Chemical Weapons Convention. And this covers a variety of actions. It covers, for example, the supply of key components to a nuclear weapon state. It covers the participation in nuclear strike exercises that Hans referred to earlier, or the endorsement or participation of nuclear, the endorsement of use or the participation in nuclear planning. And as Greta mentioned, it is in Europe that the biggest problems exist. 32 of 47 states are not compatible with one or more of the TPNW prohibitions. That's the 3 nuclear weapon states within Europe and the 29 so-called umbrella states. That means that policy shifts in Europe are critical if we want to get serious about nuclear disarmament. We had a treaty a few years ago, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, that prohibited short and intermediate range missiles, including, of course, all nuclear missiles from Europe. Russia decided it was no longer in their interest, and the US crashed the treaty as a result. We had removed those weapons from Europe. We had dismantled, destroyed them in the 1980s. That process was successful. It was verified for the 10 years that the verification process existed. We had no allegations of violations. Those days are gone. There are no bilateral constraints on the United States and the Soviet Union in terms of weapons and deployment, and there are no prohibitions on the deployment of the Oreshnik that Hans referred to. We are not in a good place. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you to the 3 of you. Very, very interesting and information-packed briefings. There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm sure you've got a lot of questions. So I'm going to throw it open now to questions. And just a reminder that when you ask your question, can you give your name and the organisation that you represent? And for those of you online, you can indicate whether you want to ask a question or write it in the chat function, I think, and it will be passed to me. So with that, I throw it open. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alicia Gar from the Spanish news agency, Agencia F. I have several questions. I wanted to ask if you could explain a little bit more what you mean by umbrella countries, because you talk about arrangements that they have. If you could explain a little bit more, what are these arrangements about and why they are dangerous in this nuclear proliferation? And also, I wanted to ask specifically about the case of Spain, because you classified as an umbrella country, and you mentioned the case of Airbus with collaboration with France. If you could explain this a little bit, and why is Spain responsible? And also, what do you think are the risks of having nuclear warheads deployed, ready to use? What are to illustrate, what are the real things? And are there anything, even if they don't activate these weapons, are there any risks even by misuse or by accidents? And also, what do you think about the intervention of a country to stop the nuclear race of another country? And I'm thinking in the case of United States attacking Iran, of course. Do you think this is an effective way of stopping a country to fabricate a nuclear weapon? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, actually, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions there. Thank you. The first one is, about the umbrella arrangements and why that's potentially dangerous. I think, Hans, you'll probably you want to kick off on that one?
Yeah, the way I look at it, there are sort of two main categories of umbrella countries. There's sort of the generic form, if you will, that a country that does not have nuclear weapon has a military alliance with a country that does, and the nuclear weapon states promises to protect, for example, in a treaty form, to protect that country if it's attacked. It would protect it with nuclear weapons and defend it, right? So that's one form. A subcategory under these umbrella countries are called nuclear sharing countries. Those are countries that not only have that security guarantee, but they actually provide their national forces, for example, air forces, equip them with the capability to deliver the nuclear weapon states nuclear weapons in wartime. And they also train their pilots to do that job. So there are those two levels of them, and we see therefore the vast majority of countries are sort of the first category of general nuclear umbrella countries that are protected by, for example, a treaty like the North Atlantic Treaty. But there are also arrangements in the Pacific and possibly, it sounds like, in the Middle East as well. So that's the big category as far as I see.
Yeah, if I can add a little bit to that. A nuclear umbrella state is a state that has an arrangement with one or more nuclear armed allies of what's called extended nuclear deterrence, meaning that nuclear armed state's protection is spread over that country as well. And among the umbrella states, there are some that are more active in their roles as umbrella states and some that are a little bit less active. But when it comes to the states in NATO, they all endorse NATO's strategic concept, which where nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence is a key element. So in order to not be counted as an umbrella state when you're a NATO country, that state would have to disassociate itself by some means. And in their practices, of course, but also in forms of a statement or a footnote, this is how it can be done as well, that declares that a country does not support the possession or use of nuclear weapons. And it's possible to do that in NATO as well. To have your own view on nuclear weapons. In the report, there is a table that shows all of the umbrella states and looks at different categories of activities that umbrella states typically do in being umbrella states. And as you can see from that table, there are some that are more active and some less active. And Spain among those that are not so active as others.
Anything to add, Stu?
On the other questions, yeah.
All right. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the Spain status, do you want to talk about the Spanish situation?
Yeah, we'd like to see more from Spain. We had a hope a few years ago that Spain was going to engage a little more actively with the TPNW. There were some positive signs. At the very least, we're not necessarily expecting Spain to leave NATO and suddenly join. We're not unrealistic. But come to the TPNW meetings as an observer. Talk about victim assistance and environmental remediation, as I'm sure you're aware. 60 years ago, plutonium was cast across Spanish territory in Palomares when there was a nuclear accident involving US aircraft. Still has not been properly cleared up by the United States. Those kind of things are in Spain's interests as they are in everybody else's interests. And we would like to see Spain engage more positively with the convention, with the treaty, sorry. And on the issue of Iran, if you are North Korea today, what's the message that you take from that act of aggression against Iran by Israel and the United States? There is only one thing you take from that. It's better to have nuclear weapons than it isn't. And that is a catastrophic message to be passing. Why now, if Trump goes to Kim Jong-un and says, oh, I'd like you to give up your nuclear weapons, why on earth would he consider doing that? Sorry.
Airbus. her question around Spain and Airbus.
Yeah, so where you have a private company on your territory that is engaged in support for the development of nuclear weapons technology, which is more often the case, you know, missiles and so on, you are assisting the development of nuclear weapons. You are also, I would suggest, encouraging the possession of nuclear weapons, but it is that direct assistance that's occurring. The fact that it's a private company does not matter as a matter of international law. If they're headquartered on your territory, or if they have a factory or an office on your territory that is in any way engaged in that development process, then you are assisting the nuclear weapons program. And for that reason, they would not be compatible with the TPNW.
Okay. We've got a few more questions. I'll keep them in reserve.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Riyad Bazia. I'm an international correspondent and I am international civil society in the UN since a while. Yes, yes, you raised the humanitarian consequences, the humanitarian disasters, but how about the environmental consequences? I didn't hear anything about the environment. It's very important to raise that, the consequences now and later. Yeah. My second questions, it is about, yes, those states, parties that you have ratify or sign 196, 97, which means all states members in all the planet, including the farthest, smallest island. How can we understand that's motivation? Are you competing the landmines treaty? And my last question, it's linked with the Spanish colony, Western Sahara, because nowadays we are talking they are raised also, maybe there were or there were not nuclear in Western Sahara in that time, and the environmental consequences like in the Algerian Sahara. I don't know how we can, because publishing a monitor without raising that, without elaborating, we can elaborate that in your edition. I stop here. I hope it was clear.
So just to recap, you're talking about the environmental consequences of the use of and the production of nuclear weapons. Yeah. And also about the 197 eligible states. What I wasn't quite clear what your question was. That's motivation. Having all state members. Their motivations in joining the treaty. Oh, okay. What's in their interest, you mean? Okay. 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 So you get why universalization?
Universal signing, having also usually in the international treaty in the UN, it's difficult to convince states parties to join the treaty. We have only few states at the beginning, and for many years we can have 50 or 70 or 100.
Okay.
Yeah, how can we understand that motivation? Are you competing also? I'm thinking the landmines legal treaty, Ottawa Treaty.
Thank you. So we have, I think, Stuart, you actually referred.
Yeah, I'm going to have to come back on that.
You referred to victim assistance.
I'll deal with both of them, but I think you probably want to talk about the report. I agree with everything you said, except the facts and the law. Let me clarify what I mean by that. There are 193 states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. How can you say that's not universal? There are 189 states parties to the Biological Weapons Convention. How can you say that that's not universal? There are other treaties that have lesser adherence, but it is in everybody's interest to be a party to a treaty that outlaws weapons of mass destruction. That has to be the way forward. And the more states that join the TPNW, the bigger the pressure on those states that have nuclear weapons to start to get serious, to start to talk seriously about nuclear disarmament. We're over the halfway mark now at 99 states, parties and signatories. That's an achievement. We need to go a lot further and we need to go a lot faster. On the environmental one, we fully agree, and I'm sure Greta's going to talk about the 400-page document that we published a couple of months ago on environmental impact and victim assistance. Greta?
Yeah, no,
No, you won't.
No, I don't think we'll take the time to do that now. Because there was one unanswered question.
Yeah. We have a question from an online join in a second, but yeah, we had the question about from the FA about what are the risks, what are the inherent risks in having weapons deployed and ready for use?
Well, so there are two layers there. There was one part of the question that also had to do with the environmental legacy of nuclear weapons production. And that is a nasty history. There have been enormous environmental consequences and humanitarian consequences of the nuclear arms race, developing of them. We know that back in the United States, for example, from the nuclear weapons production facilities, many of them turned into nasty, what they call Superfund sites that basically are, contaminated. And we spent hundreds of billions of dollars cleaning up these facilities later. In the nuclear weapons testing programs from around the world, nuclear weapons states that develop nuclear weapons typically in the early years preferred to test their nuclear weapons far away from home on someone else's territory or their territory that they had claimed. And so we saw the French testing in the Pacific. We saw the Russians in Kazakhstan. We saw the Americans out in the Pacific. And we saw the French in Northern Africa, and we saw the British in Australia. So it was typical, go somewhere else and do this stuff. And sure enough, especially when radioactive fallout came from atmospheric tests, this was a huge problem. But even with underground nuclear tests, we've seen some significant damage. There's some very interesting reports just over the last 5 years that have come out from Princeton University, where they've examined the French nuclear testing program out, even when it went underground in the atolls, of significant damage to these structures and pollution. So anyway, so there's effect from that history and the production of it. And so when people say that no one has died from nuclear weapons yet, except from, of course, the bombings of Japan in those days, that's not quite true. But it's also true that it's been very hard to get information, official information out of the nuclear weapon states about what the consequences actually were. And so they tend to hold on to that information. And so on the issue of the operational risk of nuclear weapons, here they're twofold. There's one that has to do with, like what we heard before, when you operate these things, for example, if you fly them, you can have accidents. You transport them, they can, not detonate like a nuclear weapon. That's not the major concern here, if they're built well. But you can have detonation of the conventional explosives in them that can scatter the plutonium and uranium that's in the weapon. That's what happened in Spain. That's what happened in several places in the United States. It's what happened in Thule in northern Greenland back in 1968. So there have been plenty of those types of accidents in the Cold War. The nuclear armed states, to significant extent, reacted to those kind of accidents early on by restricting transports of nuclear weapons under normal circumstances. So today, for example, in the US Air Force, bombers and fighter jets do not fly with nuclear weapons, live nuclear weapons. They are transported on transport aircraft, C-17s, both within the United States, also between the United States and Europe. And the Chinese transport their nuclear weapons by train and truck, the Russians by train and truck and some aircraft. And you have similar arrangements in other nuclear weapon states. So you can have accidents all the time when things are on the move. And in fact, in the risk assessments and safety programs of the nuclear armed states, it is quite clearly recognized that the most vulnerable time of a nuclear weapon is when it is in transport, when it's out of its bunker on some kind of vehicle that's transporting to another location. So there's that. And then finally, of course, the issue that, if you have nuclear weapons on a base in your country, you are a nuclear target. That comes with the territory. So there's no freebie here. You get involved in the nuclear business, and you may be a target for a variety of reasons, but you're certainly a target if you have nuclear weapons on your territory.
And beyond that, of course, Hans, as you spoke about briefly before, with the deployments, the exercises, etc., the risks of nuclear entanglement and escalation, misunderstandings that can also lead to intended use and not just accidents as well. Do you want to say a few words about
It's
that?
just that, yeah, you know, we see it now, for example, it's not that if some aircraft is flying, you know, that can carry nuclear weapons, but then you'll have a misunderstanding that countries will then suddenly decide, oh my God, we thought it carried nuclear weapons. In normal times, that's not the issue. It's the issue that if you get into a conventional war and very tense situation, that rumors or misunderstandings begin to emerge that an aircraft or some transport involves nuclear weapons, you can get overreactions and it can worsen the situation significantly. And significantly also, one of the problems is that a lot of these short-range nuclear weapon systems are dual capable, meaning that they can carry either conventional or nuclear. But you can't necessarily see from outside, you know, what's coming there. Is it carrying nuclear or is it carrying conventional? That has to be communicated or understood. But when you have dual capable forces, then you have a significant, in a tense situation, a significantly greater risk for misunderstanding and overreaction because you misinterpret what is going on.
I mean, I think there is a concrete example of this from the 1980s, where NATO carried out an exercise called Able Archer, which the Soviet leadership thought could be a feint for a nuclear attack, and they went to alert status. This is a concrete example of how a misunderstanding, how these exercises can lead to misunderstanding. It's worth looking it up.
It is
a fascinating
story.
story.
There's a whole book on that exercise. Fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, so we have two questions on Iran and the implications of what's going on in the war on Iran by the US and Israel. One was from FA talking about, you know, is this an effective way to prevent proliferation? If I understand the question. And the other question is from someone who's joining us online, John Lettman from Hawaii. Is how is the current US-Israeli war on Iran likely to influence possible nuclear proliferation? You've kind of alluded to that already in terms of what Kim Jong-un might conclude from this, but who wants to take those Iran-linked questions? Stuart?
I just don't see how this furthers the cause of nuclear non-proliferation. As we noted, we had Iran as a state of concern. That's already been, I would say, reduced by the bombing that took place in June of last year. The ongoing bombing is effectively going to obliterate any opportunity for the Iranians to gain nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. But the message that gets passed to other states is, if you don't want the US to bomb you and you're not an ally of the United States, you need to find some sort of insurance policy. And that may be through extended deterrence, or worryingly, it may be through the acquisition of nuclear or some other weapon of mass destruction capability. And in no sense is that a positive development.
Anything to add, Hans?
If anything, I'll say something like, what I find fascinating about this situation, of course, is that when you start bombing a country with an official reasoning that it's to knock out its nuclear capability, you're sort of saying our non-proliferation efforts have failed, and this is our last resort. In the case of Iran, there is no immediate danger. It's not like Iran, you know, if the US hadn't bombed, then they would be able to launch a nuclear weapon. That's not the case. The case was about whether they can amass enough fissile material to be able to produce such a weapon if they go that way. But this is where I find it sort of, when you get to that stage, it is an entanglement of the nuclear and general security issues that a country is facing. And we have to remember here, countries don't go nuclear just because of nuclear. They go nuclear quite often because of threats against them with conventional forces. And so that is why we have situations of considerations of countries discussing nuclear weapons issues. And you have problems with convincing nuclear weapon states and umbrella countries to give up nuclear weapons, because they argue this is not just about nuclear weapons, it's also about conventional situations. Why would China give up nuclear weapons if they feel threatened by advanced conventional forces, and other countries as well? I mean, so you really have to think about this deeper than just nuclear, but of course, nuclear an important sort of a component in your face, but it's beyond just nuclear in my view.
Greta, do you have? Okay. So we have a couple of questions now from Anton TV. What is the most disturbing development in today's nuclear arsenal development? So what are the most disturbing trends that you have identified? And can we trust official numbers and data when it comes to nuclear arsenals? Key question for your research. I think those are probably for you, Hans.
So on the last part, the numbers we put out are estimates. They're not official numbers. You have to get that into your head. We always get this. There's no sort of phone book on nuclear weapons around the world where countries declare what they have. These are the crown jewels and surrounded with enormous amount of secrecy. There are some cases where countries have decided that there are bits and pieces of the nuclear situation they can disclose, because that wouldn't matter, they say. So, for example, in the United States, we saw under the Obama administration, they for the first time disclosed the entire history of the size of the US nuclear stockpile. How many nuclear warheads did they actually have in the military stockpile? Then when the Trump administration came in, they decided no longer to disclose this stuff. Then the Biden administration came in, they decided to do that after all. Now the Trump administration is in and they have not released any information about this and unlikely to do so. So this goes back and forth. What we're now beginning to see is that while countries themselves will not release numbers of nuclear weapons, they begin to get very happy about releasing estimates about what the adversaries have. So you get sort of an adversarial transparency, if you will, because it benefits them in their national debate when they have to go in Congress and argue for more nuclear weapons funding, et cetera. They can show some numbers, right? In the public debate, look how many they have, therefore. And so that's a different kind of transparency. It's not the transparency that the nuclear weapons state itself is doing. It is the transparency that their adversaries, potential adversaries, are doing to get some more funding.
And in terms of the most disturbing?
So the most disturbing trend for me, at least, apart from the fact that sort of we have now sunk this era of nuclear reductions, that it is over, we're going the other way. The most problematic trend for me is this sort of lust for nuclear that is coming back as fixes to security problems. That countries, individuals in the debate almost automatically reach for a nuclear solution to a security problem. And we see this both in the nuclear weapon states. Suddenly, they begin to argue, oh, it's necessary to have this in a nuclear weapon system and that nuclear weapon system. And because if we just have that one, well, then the adversary will think twice about it. And in other countries, in the debates, you find people that previously argued that they had concerns about nuclear weapons issues and, for a variety of reasons, now find themselves being sort of in a camp where they're saying, yeah, well, this is a dangerous situation. Therefore, getting some extra nuclear weapons is perhaps not such a bad thing. They start going along with this reversal. And so part of that gives us this situation where nuclear armed states are beginning to create more scenarios, more strike options, more entanglements with nuclear weapons in various strike scenarios. We see this mainly with tactical nuclear weapons, like short-range nuclear weapons, but that's not the only category. It's also happening with strategic. So this is sort of this the elevation of the importance and prominence and salience of nuclear weapons in everything that is going on right now. That's my biggest concern, because it just seems to have, it's on autopilot. There is absolutely no critical discussion about, is this really needed, or should we have something else instead, or how can we otherwise strengthen non-proliferation efforts and norms? The nuclear posturing is on autopilot. That is my biggest concern.
Thank you. Greta, do you have something to add?
Yeah, this autopilot of increasing the value, this dynamic between action and reaction that we are seeing is definitely what concerns me the most, and how present that dynamic is in Europe and the European national discussions now. It's understandable, of course. Security concerns are real. I just want to emphasize that. It's understandable. But it becomes very Eurocentric and very, our needs, while it's clear that in terms of nuclear weapons, our needs are also the global needs. And this lack of thinking about what the impact will be of this autopilot in Europe for the rest of the world. There's a lot of focus on the having to be under an umbrella in Europe. But what if we have, what if China starts putting countries under their under an umbrella? What if Russia's umbrella expands? What if Indonesia hadn't joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but instead the US or China tried to, put it under their umbrella, and we end up with a world where every bit of the world is under someone's umbrella, or more nuclear weapons developing countries as well. So we are, as Stuart said, very much so starting to be back at the place where we were in the 1950s and 1960s, where politicians understood that they had to ask themselves the question that if we don't do something, and we are at that stage again now. So that question, what can we do now beyond looking at our own security, immediate security needs to be asked by politicians, not least in Europe, because it can have a big impact if we have more progressive politicians on this in Europe.
Okay, thank you. Question from the room now.
Yeah, I'm Rajkumar from India, formerly with the UN and other international organizations. Very interesting. I noted that two countries of concern you mentioned was Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran is well known for a lot of reasons, but could you speak a little more about Saudi Arabia, because we seem to be unaware of what is happening about it. Another half a question. I think post Second World War, there have been two major accidents, Fukushima, Chernobyl. So are there other incidents, accidents, which may not be in the public domain, which you will like? Because there was something which said, well, not only people died in the bombings, but they also died later on also related to the nuclear plants.
Okay, Stuart, you want to start on that? So Saudi Arabia first.
Sure. So Saudi Arabia signed a mutual defense agreement with Pakistan, by which, if you believe the terms that have been announced publicly, Saudi Arabia comes under Pakistan's nuclear umbrella. That does not mean that Saudi Arabia has given up all thought of itself acquiring nuclear weapons. It may make it less likely, I'm not entirely sure, but in the past, Saudi Arabia has made it very clear, if Iran starts to get a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will start to get a nuclear weapon. As you probably know, an agreement was signed with the United States. Saudi Arabia's civil nuclear energy sector is starting to develop. That inevitably creates plutonium as a byproduct. And then the question is that going to be under full safeguards? Now, there's some good news that the Saudis had what is called a small quantities protocol, because they didn't have significant quantities of fissile material, nuclear material in the past. They now have that. And they had a very old SQP that was not fit for purpose because it did not give the IAEA the right to come in and inspect. They have rescinded that original SQP. That's a step forward. But we need Saudi Arabia to join and stay in the additional protocol to the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement so that the IAEA can go and poke around anywhere in Saudi Arabia that they have a concern that there might be enrichment going on or other forms of development. We haven't seen that confirmed yet, and that's what we need to see.
Okay. Yeah, anything to add on Saudi Arabia? We can move on to the.
There was a question on accidents.
Yeah. So you're talking about other accidents involving nuclear weapons that might not be so well known.
Yeah, we don't know all of them. Is the reality? Often they're called broken arrow incidents, but we are pretty certain that there are a few US bombers at the bottom of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean that were carrying nuclear weapons. Some of them disappeared off the radar. They're not normally reported, but it is, I would say, almost certain that there are nuclear weapons around somewhere. We've mentioned Palomares. There was a bomb that was dropped over, I think it was it South Carolina? North Carolina. There was a bomb that was dropped and all but one safeties failed. So they were one safety away from obliterating their own country. They were transporting a nuclear weapons. This is in the 50s or 60s, I think.
Early 60s.
Early 60s. So there's actually a little plaque you can go and visit, which gently meant here was an accident involving an aircraft carrying nuclear weapons. I think that kind of understates the significance of the issue. So we haven't had the equivalent of Chernobyl and Fukushima, luckily, so far, but we're gambling. We're gambling with dice, and sooner or later, our luck will run out.
We'll just add I think there's an official list on the part of the United States where they declared sort of loss and significant incident with nuclear weapons. I think it's something like 35 cases or something like that over the years. And the last of those, as far as I remember, was in 1968. It was in Tula, Greenland, where the B-52 crashed with 4 nuclear weapons on board. And the Soviet Union had several accidents. I think the most recent ones were in the 80s. There was one in 86 where a Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine off the U.S. East Coast had one of the missiles exploding, the fuel, and it later sank with all the nuclear weapons and 2 nuclear reactors on board. There was I think it was 1989, over the Norwegian Sea, a Soviet Mikey-class attack submarine went to the bottom, and I think the assumption is that it had 2 nuclear weapons on board. And so, but then if you don't fly and you don't transport nuclear weapons, then you won't have accidents with them, And so this is one of the consequences, that if you deploy nuclear weapons, you will sooner or later have an accident. It most likely will not, at least in the modern nuclear weapon states, not involve a nuclear explosion. The weapons are designed so that is very almost impossible to accomplish. But in new weapon states that have similar weapon designs and not nearly as long a history of nuclear safety and security features, that may not at all be the case. You might very well have a nuclear detonation if you have a nuclear weapons accident. So it's very different from country to country. So these are some of the things you can look forward to.
Okay, thank you. One more question from the room, and then we have one more question online from AFP, and then I think we'll wrap. So
I thank you so much for your presentation, and I don't have a question per se, more than of a comment on the status of what the MPT have turned on. My name is Mahmoud. I'm from Egypt, and when we try to see how the MPT have evolved across the years since its entry into force till the current situation ahead of the 11th review conference, we find that the three pillars the MPT was established on are actually turned it into more of an apartheid regime, not as you just mentioned regarding India's concern of it being a discriminatory regime, making it only or shifting the focus on the non-proliferation issues and not addressing the disarmament pillar of the MPT, and also regarding the absence of negative security assurances, especially that in the past 4 years, we have 2 nuclear weapon states attacking non-nuclear weapon states and 1 nuclear armed states, although in Egypt we don't approve of that term, attacking that country. And adding to the fascinating point you just mentioned on the failure of non-proliferation regimes on our efforts on Iran, having a nuclear armed state attacking another non-nuclear weapon state to prevent it from having nuclear weapons is more fascinating, actually. And also, one last comment regarding the 9 states which are actually trying to accelerate the number of warheads that they have. You state that all 8 countries are actually exerting effort to increase their warheads, aside from 1 country. I would have to argue back regarding the lack of information that we have from Israel on the number of warheads they even have or they're trying to increase or not. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to talk a little bit more detail about why you came to the conclusion that Israel was not increasing the size of its arsenal, or is there
I mean, I leave that for that. I was going to actually address the first question around the MPT, if that's okay, because it's a very good question. As you know, when it was designed, the MPT had a fixed lifespan, 25 years, as you obviously know, from the entry into force in 1970. There was a lot of pressure put on states, including Egypt, but not by no means only Egypt, to extend the lifetime of the MPT without limitation. Could I suggest that, with the benefit of hindsight, giving blank checks to the 5 nuclear weapon states was not the world's greatest decision? I understand that it was a difficult time. It was in some ways a fortuitous time, because it was after the end of the Cold War. Numbers were coming down. There seemed to be genuine hope that we were moving into a new era. As we all know, unfortunately, those hopes have been dashed. And what constrains them from keeping nuclear weapons forever? I don't see enough, frankly. I don't know if you want to talk about Israel and the numbers.
Yeah, Israel is sort of a strange or a complicated case, because compared to so many other nuclear weapon states, there's very little information available from Israel. Much has come out in the form of declassified documents, especially from the US side, and also interviews with people that were involved in the Israeli nuclear program over the years. They've sort of gradually built more and more texture to the Israeli situation. But one of the reasons the Israelis are not very active, if you will, with nuclear, and I say that with trepidation, because of course one of the issues is whether they have built nuclear cruise missiles into their attack submarines, and this is an ongoing debate. Nonetheless, Israel, compared to other nuclear weapon states, has a very clear separation, if you will, of the nuclear warheads from the military, and at least to the extent it's understood. And so they're not even stored together, nor the warheads stored in a fully assembled form. And so there are a number of steps they have to go through, if you will. So that's just to say Israel is sort of a very opaque country, not just because they're secret, but because literally they're very good at being secret. So that's the way it works.
Thank you. So I've got one last question from Nina Larson from AFP, or there are 2 questions actually. One returns to the Middle East, and it's talking about less about the proliferation issue specifically, and more about what the impact of the Israeli-US attack on Iran might be on attitudes towards nuclear weapons generally in the world? And has it increased the risk of accidental use? And her second question is, do you have confidence, given that leaders of the 9 nuclear armed states have enormous power and responsibility in their hands, do you have confidence that the current crop or any crop of leaders can handle the responsibility, I guess, in a crisis to make the decision to use nuclear weapons? And, you know, in the context of the current conflict, current war on Iran, is that a perfect storm that dramatically increases the risk of use, having this sort of, as it were, coming together of incredibly sort of unstable and unpredictable forces that's been unleashed by this conflict? So who would like to have a go at those one or two first? I mean, you don't need to take both, but
I'm not sure I have anything to add to what we said on the first question. The answer to the second question is no.
you have no confidence.
Where is there any statesmanship today? In the past, we had deeply flawed individuals who were statesmen. You look at somebody like Nixon. He for all the things we can criticize him for, in the nuclear sphere, he made progress. In biological weapons, he made progress. There was genuine progress despite the flaws. Today, all I see is flawed individuals without that statesmanship. Maybe I'm too old and cynical, but I just don't see, where are the ideas out there that we can kickstart some form of disarmament? How can we replace New START? I see nothing at the moment. Maybe, I mean, Hans, you're very close to this. Maybe you see some positive signs, but I don't see them, frankly.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's one that, I mean, there is a long debate about this, and there's an ongoing debate about whether leaders can be stable or trusted or have a chance to be stable. One of the things that happens when you have nuclear arsenals that, large nuclear arsenals that are on very high alert, can hit your country very fast, is that it sort of moves your mindset and your military planning toward worst case scenarios, very short decision timelines. It takes 30 minutes for a missile to fly across the Atlantic. It takes only 15 minutes if you launch it from a missile submarine that's off the coast. And that's no time to make decisions. And so in those situations, you would have countries go into sort of prepared reaction patterns. And that is, you know, riddled with danger about misunderstanding and overreaction and what have you. This is actually getting worse in the sense that we now see these hypersonic weapon systems in the regions being developed that will even further shorten the window of action and you know, consideration for what is done. But I'm also of the view that, in my experience, you know, I actually think that, ironically, the danger is not so much in the military as much as it is in this sort of civilian side of governments. Because in my view, that's where you cook up, that's where you see these crazy ideas and these new autopilot tendencies for nuclear, you know, nuclear strategy and what have you. My experience with talking to military people that are involved in the nuclear business is that they're a lot more conservative and much more aware about what the consequences of potential use and misunderstandings are. And one thing that really struck me about this whole discussion about Ukraine, when people started reacting to the Russian threats again and again and again, and early on there, an American military official I talked to in one of the conferences, I said, you know, so what would you do if the Russians used nuclear weapons in Ukraine? And the first word out of that person's mouth was, we would try to de-escalate. That was I mean, it's like, that's what it's about. It's not about, we will hit them back because then we're strong. I mean, it was about, how do we manage this thing and get it back to where it should be? So that's what I'm saying. It's a mixed bag, but I think there's sort of a simplistic thing that, you know, the military is dangerous because they have nuclear weapons, and the civilian leadership is stupid, but, you know, they're going to do a rational thing. But even there, from country to country, it varies a lot. Be that as it may, I think the overarching issue with the salience of nuclear weapons now increasing again, with the numbers, with the types, with the forward operation, with the nuclear antagonism and threats and whatever. The problem with that is that you're moving these defects in the system sort of into a more tense situation where they will have to perform or fail. And so I think that's the danger we should try to move away from.
Add a few words to that. We don't have to consider the current crop of leaders in the 9 nuclear armed states in particular to answer yes or no on whether we trust them. There are no safe hands for this system and these trends that you describe. So it's clear that situations can arise where the use of nuclear weapons could be seen as an option. And the normalization that we are seeing from particularly European states now, and particularly European umbrella states, how their actions, their policies, their statements now are contributing to normalization of nuclear weapons, how that drives these risks and can lead to the trends that Hans described earlier in this presentation, to a situation that can lead to nuclear use. Why there is so little reflection on that, on the normalization that they are contributing to, puzzles me.
Thank you. I think that's a good place to end. Thanks everybody for coming online as well as in the room, and thanks for some really good questions. There's an awful lot more in that report, in the monitor, so I recommend it as bedtime reading. Yeah, I mean, I think it was Ban Ki-moon who said there are no right hands for wrong weapons. So on the question of who should have responsibility, it's the weapons that are the problem base, as well as not only the potential unstable people. So again, thank you very much for coming. And any questions you have, if you have follow-up questions or interview requests, get in touch with me or with Teresa from Norwegian People's Aid here, if you want to follow up. Thank you very much.
It's scribbled in it.
Yeah.